again, a very warm welcome, I think, from all of us. Thank you very much, PreSeed Ventures, for organizing this conversation on impact, ESG, and what that all means for venture capital. Just in terms of the agenda for today, so we have about an hour. We'll make sure that there's enough space for all of you to get heard from the audience. Please feel free to put your questions as we go along in the Q&A. We'll have a section towards the end. We make that 10 to 15 minutes or so, where you can then also raise your hand to ask questions if you feel more comfortable with that. But we'll have a conversation between all of us, and we'll all introduce ourselves in a second to discuss some of what might be the basics of this new trend, new development when it comes to venture capital. I'll kick us off with a very, very quick overview of what I've been observing in this space before we're diving right into questions around what even is impact for venture capital, how does that compare to ESG, who is really pushing this agenda, what's concretely happening, what are best practices that are already kind of becoming visible, and where challenging factors going forward, what does the future hold and what is holding us back to begin with. But perhaps to quickly kick us off here, so I'm Johannes Lenhard. I am not a venture investor, at least not full time. I do that every now and then and have done so for a decade, but my main job is I'm an academic at Cambridge and have been there since 2011. And for the last 4 years, I've spent talking to people like all of the others here in this room, GPs and VC funds, somewhere between Silicon Valley and Europe. And I speak to them about what I call their ethics. And one of the questions that comes up and again and has come up increasingly so is, what does all of this impact talk about? What does impact mean? ESG, which stands for environmental, social governance issues and principles. What does that have to do with early stage investing in venture capital? And I've increasingly recently spoken to both commercial investors, and we have both of these parties here in the room, as well as people that would call themselves impact VCs or ESG-driven VCs, VCs that are aligned with the SDGs, so the Sustainable Development Goals, and we get into that in a second. Over the last 12 to 18 months, and there was definitely a conceivable uptake in not only conversations about this, driven not at all really from the VC space, but from big business organizations like the Business Roundtable in 2019, announcing that we have to shift away from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. The Think letters, so BlackRock's CEO, talking more and more about purpose in business, going beyond just profit making. There's a much bigger narrative and shift in the business world more generally towards thinking beyond making money for the very small amount of shareholders in a company or in a fund. And we're now at a point where this is also really having an impact on venture capital and early stage companies and their investors, right? And that's why we are coming together here. It's been an interesting observation that Europe, for once in this world that really is dominated by conversations about Silicon Valley and how all of the entrepreneurial geniuses are sitting on the west coast of the US, actually Europe is ahead of this game, right? Which is what makes this conversation here with mostly Scandinavian, continental European investors even more prevalent, because what we might actually be seeing is that these are really the four riders and the most progressive thinkers in this space. But let's start with a quick round of introduction. Let's go around the room, starting with you, Agate, introducing each and all of you before we dive right in.
Sure, thank you so much. Hi everyone, great to see so many of you. I'm Agate, I'm one of the partners at Norrsken VC, and we're an early stage fund focused on backing impact tech companies. And what I mean by impact tech companies, it's the ones where really profit and impact goes hand in hand, where we can surely say that for every unit of sales, there is also a unit of impact. So that's my super short intro. I don't know who's going next.
PJ, do you want to go next? And then we do Richard and end with Philip.
Yeah. Hi, I'm PJ. I'm a partner with the Northzone, not to be confused with Norrsken, although it's We are a early stage venture capital company, has been around for 25 years. We're on our 9th fund, $500 million to invest from the most recent one. We have offices in Stockholm, London, and New York, and we have invested in a large array of companies over the past 25 years, maybe 200 or so companies.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Richard, and I'm partner and one of the co-founders of PreSeed Ventures' new dedicated pre-seed stage fund, one of the first institutional backed VCs or pre-seed stage funds out of Denmark. We think that we as investors have a big responsibility and also opportunity for moving the next generation of tech startups in a more sustainable way. Therefore, we have developed an ESG strategy for both our own operation as a fund, for how to apply the E, S, and G, and also the SDGs in our investment process, and how we can help our portfolio companies across the ESG dimensions. So looking very much forward to this discussion and this very important topic.
And then I continue. My name is Filip, one of the partners at Cherry Ventures. We are a Berlin-based fund that has a strong focus on seed round. We invest across Europe. We have a partner also in Stockholm and a team in London and in Paris. So we invest across Europe, focused basically on this very early first round in getting a company from idea to product market fit. And yeah, looking forward to the discussion today. I think you're right. It's a new topic. At the same time, I think maybe it is a new way of framing the topic, because at the end of the day, for us, ESG and the related discussions comes down to mainly one point, right? How can we be proud of what we are doing, right? How can we actually make a positive impact on the world? Of course, we all want to be successful as investors, but I think what we do has to go beyond that. And so yeah, I'm looking forward to discussing some of the best practices, things we've tried, things we've failed with and learned. So hope it's going to be a good discussion.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for the introductions. Having done this conversation a couple of times in different setups, there is always a confusion about what it even is that we're talking about, right? So I would like to start by just setting a baseline of what is impact, and then we've already heard several of these words, right? ESG, SDGs, and then possibly also putting that against some of the other bits. And Agate, you're a dedicated impact fund. You're investing in dedicated impactful companies. Perhaps you can set a standard here of what it is that you would say impact is, and then perhaps we'll hand over to Richard to put his ESG focus next to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess impact is an impact in a nutshell, and that can be both positive and negative. And sometimes I realize that we don't make enough distinction between the two. But you know what we specifically mean with impact, we mean it that positive, active, measurable, intentional impact to let's say move the world one direction further towards something good. And for us, I mean, the way we define impact for ourselves when we look at impact companies, it's like a couple of sort of these tests that we apply. One is one that I mentioned, that we're really looking for this one-to-one correlation that you can say, you know, for every dollar of sales, I also have some kind of unit of measurable impact. The other test that we always run on all the companies that we look at is, okay, is there a possibility that this company could somehow pivot out of being an impact company? Could I switch off the impact? And if the answer is yes, then that's not our type of impact company, at least to start with. So there are all of these different kind of tweaks and measures, but ultimately what we're after is positive impact on the world. And I think, of course, we can debate for a very long time how exactly to measure, what exactly should be a measurement. But, you know, the day-to-day practicality comes down to if it is an impact company, the way to measure it will become fairly obvious. And maybe it's not going to be some kind of incredibly perfect measure to the last decimal place, but you will be at least directionally right, and you should be able to pinpoint exactly what is the impact that you're creating. And that's at least our way of looking at it.
Yeah, absolutely. Richard, do you want to jump in there and just put against that what you think ESG is possibly versus impact, or overlapping with impact, or where there is?
Sure, and maybe also how we see it, because it's a little bit complicated and there's a lot of terms for different things. But maybe I can also start with that. I think all companies can actually work with the ESG factors and the framework to move in, so to say, in a more sustainable direction on both E, S, and G. And I think it makes a lot of sense both for the society and for the world we're living in. But I do actually also think that it's good investment financially. Working on this, I mean, and I think companies embracing this and working on this will actually perform better than their peers not working on it. So I don't think really it's a trade-off. So, and then when it comes to impact, I think it's a little bit more blurry in the definition to me, and it depends a lot on who you ask, because I think most VC firms will invest in visionary founders working on solving important problems. And if you do that and you become successful on the way, you will create a lot of growth and jobs to the benefit of the society. But then you can discuss which problems are more important to solve and to which extent are you working on these ESGs. Is it directly to the core, or is it more like a technology platform you can build further on? And that's a more blurry discussion. So we actually don't call our fund an impact fund. Maybe we should, I don't know. But actually, I think we believe that we will make a huge impact, and we will hopefully also back as many companies as possible within tech working on solving the SDGs, because we think there's a big potential to build unicorns within this category. So I think that's a little bit how we see it. So I think you will also see us invest in technology platforms. I mean, we've just done an investment in a company developing something within explainable AI. And I think they don't call themselves an impact company, but I think they will drive a huge impact. Also, all the other companies building on top of that stack.
But there's definitely a business case here, right? We're quite clear, and Agate, that might be different in your case. We're quite clear that when it comes to ESG, what you're saying, Richard, is there's no trade-off. You're not intending to go in a ESG principle / almost impact solving SDG problems way and sacrificing returns, right?
No, but I think there's a lot of discussion, and I think it used to be that, but I think actually sometimes there's no trade-off between those things. I think if you solve some of the biggest challenges we see in the world, you can also build big companies based on that. And I think also how the VC model works. I mean, I cannot go back to my investors and said, okay, I didn't create this return, but instead I invested in 10 female startups or whatever. I think it needs to go hand in hand. And I think actually also that we are seeing a new generation of startups working on these problems, and why we don't see this trade-off. And we also see more, so to say, impact fund coming from the, so to say, traditional VC tech side. So I think things are moving more, I mean, closer to each other in a way.
Yeah. There's this, and handing over to Filip and PJ now, possibly, there's this older idea of what ESG is, and also what ESG is versus impact, that comes from other asset classes, particularly the buyout, and from the US, where ESG is thought through almost through a legal lens. It's about compliance, it's more about risk reduction, right? While what you just said, Richard, there's a financial opportunity, this is going to be the next, whatever, cohort of unicorns. We're shifting towards focusing not just on the risk, and particularly reducing risk, with things like exclusion lists, right? Which both the impact people and the ESG-driven investors would do, but we're looking more this as an opportunity. What would you say to that, perhaps Philip and then PJ?
Yeah, definitely. I think, I mean, let's look at the letters, right? E, right? Environmental criteria. So what does that mean? What does it mean for our business with regards to, you know, reducing waste, carbon emissions, and those topics? What's the S? And I think the S in venture is a whole different discussion around diversity and inclusion, for example, that, you know, I think a lot of funds are doing a lot of work on, and we're seeing improvements. And then I think the topic you were relating to more is in the G, the governance, is like how do we actually steer these companies in a responsible way? And I think we from all these, you derive an opportunity for value creation, because customers want companies to be economically, like environmentally, socially responsible, and they're demanding this from their product, and they're demanding this from these companies. And I think the way we look at it as a fund is probably sort of on 3 layers. Like the first one is, how do we make our investment decisions? So what type of companies do we invest in? Like, how do we actually think about ESG in that decision process? And then the second part, which is probably the easiest part, is like, how do we build our own team, our own company? How do we build Cherry in a, you know, ESG compliant way? And then the third one is probably the most difficult, but it also has the highest impact, which is like, how can we sort of expand that towards or across the companies that we've already invested in? PJ, you guys have even more companies with 100, but like even us as a young fund, we're getting to over 50 portfolio companies. And of course, then you reach, you know, thousands of employees, millions of revenue, and this gets to a whole different scale. So I think that's the most exciting exercise, I think, for us is like, how can we think about these measures in a way that they can affect all the founders and all the companies that we're working with.
Yeah, to tag on to that comment, I think if you take a few years back, and this coming largely from the buyout side, it started more like a requirement that was not very dissimilar to box ticking. That, you know, what do you need to do? It was more like the how about ESG. So making sure that you have your ducks in a row, that you don't screw up, and that you sort of very much from a defensive position use the ESG framework to not get into trouble. I think that was how it started, but now it has evolved. I think it's starting to also become a part of how can you differentiate both as a fund, but also the investments that you do. How do they differentiate in the market? And it's become increasingly clear that the modern companies that are successful in the marketplace, they need to be differentiating also along this dimension in order to at all be seen in the market. And when we talk to companies these days, it's very seldom that they will pull up an ESG slide and say, this is how we are ESG. It's like sort of embedded into the reason for them to exist in the first place. And that gives me great hope that we are sort of moving in the startup ecosystem sort of in a good way. Then if this is a trade-off between sort of success and profitability or like impact or something, I don't think we've really seen that play out yet, but I suspect that at some point down the line we will see a more bifurcation of the market there. But currently now I think we're leaving sort of the box ticking behind and going more leading into this in a more productive way.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, you both, Philip, Peter, you just mentioned, Philip, you made this very clear, and I think that's important to think through to begin with, and we might return to that at a later point. There's different bits to this, be it impact or ESG considerations in the venture world, from decision-making to actually do this investment. And there's something that I'm not going to put in front of you, but the question is, do I not do this investment because of ESG considerations, right? And we've just seen very interesting first big time open publicly announcements where this has happened with the Deliveroo case. And this was not VCs, this was LPs, so slightly different level and more money and so on. But that's, I think, one of the first bits. And then the second is internal fund management. We have to clear up our own house, right? Before we can really go to the portfolio and say, look, you now have to do ABC. And then supporting the portfolio. And I think that is where the value creation might actually really come in, right? You can, as you said, PJ, you can help people to build, at least at the very moment, to build almost a competitive edge by helping them to perform better on some of these ESG criteria. That takes me to a question around who is really pushing this, right? We agree that there is a development that's going on. Possibly we've already mentioned there's an LP conversation that's slightly separate, pushing down. There's a buyout side to different asset classes. You mentioned the founders. Who, from your perspective, has really been driving this agenda? Shall we go back to Richard and Agate?
Yeah, I can maybe start with that one. So I don't know, but I think it's some kind of mega trend in the society right now, accelerated by both, so to say, the climate crisis and the corona pandemic. And then I think as a fund manager, I mean, we both want to make an impact and help the world moving in a more sustainable direction. So that's more like an internal force. But we are also seeing requirements coming from all different directions. So that's more like the external side. So as a VC firm, I mean, we see requirements from our investors, from employees joining, to our customers. That means the startups and the whole ecosystem. And I actually also think that startups in an increasing way will see the same. I mean, demands from investors, from VCs that will ripple through the ecosystem, also from attracting talent, employees, customers, partners, everything. So I think it's here to stay, and I think it's coming from many different directions.
Yeah, I would say as well, I would agree that it's coming from all the different directions and it's hard to pinpoint. And you could track, for instance, if you look at LPs specifically, that, you know, probably it's already existed for 20 years in the typical LP agreement that you have prohibited sectors. So if the LP invests in you, you know, they don't want you to invest in guns or drugs or something that is obviously linked as a negative impact. And that has existed as part of our fund agreements for, I mean, I don't know, probably at least for 20 years, but you've seen it slowly evolving from prohibited sectors, sort of the negative screening, you know, don't invest in stuff that's obviously bad. And it's sort of step by step has evolved in terms of you started to see a little bit more of, okay, we expect you to invest in responsible companies. And now it's a whole new level where it is the whole spectrum of ESG. So there definitely has been evolution in the requirements, what LPs put in your agreement. But I wouldn't say that, you know, I wouldn't give all the credit just to the LPs, that the trend is driven by them. I mean, that's coming from somewhere else. And I honestly think it's coming from all of us as a society, that as a society, we're sort of just leveling up, and each one of us as individuals or as organizations, as countries, we're becoming a little bit more aware of the impact that we have on the world. And so hence it's impossible, I think, to pinpoint one single source.
Perhaps a very explicit question. Do you have the feeling that there is some LPs that you might have been in touch with that now really take this so seriously that they wouldn't invest in a fund because of ESG considerations that might have to do with the investments that they did in the past, right, with very big unintended consequences, or are we still quite far away from that? And particularly from the LP perspective, it's more of a thing that if you want, Sequoia, please, can you fill out this questionnaire? But we don't want to put too much pressure on you because we don't want to lose your allocation with you, right?
I would love for everyone to chip in, but I mean, from my experience, I think actually the strictest ones are LPs that have any kind of government taxpayer links to the source of their money, be it pension fund or EIF or many of them. Like, I think they're extremely uncompromising. And the more further down the private sector you go, the more it's down to each call of the individual LP, what exactly they're demanding.
PJ perhaps, and Philip.
No, indeed, I would totally agree to that. But I think at the end of the day, most LPs have a fiduciary duty to deliver the returns that they were paid to put there. So I think that I would say in a more confidential setting, I don't think they would claim that, yeah, we accept lower return for you because you have you're fulfilling all the ESG criteria. I don't think so, and that is perhaps a flaw in the model, or just the fact that I think there is also something problematic in itself with the ESG and the sustainable development goals. They're almost like a Chinese menu. There's so much that you can sort of optimize along or not. So it becomes almost impossible to do everything right. But what you can do is that you can decide that this is the area that is really close to you and close to your heart as an organization. And we at Northzone, we decided now it's almost 10 years ago that the one that was most important for us was actually diversity and inclusion. And the fact that we were at that point in time, we're sitting 7 guys around the table. We were all white with with the same socioeconomic background. We thought that it was actually an existential moment, because we realized that we wouldn't survive if we wouldn't change. And then it started to become important to us, and not only as parents to girls, and that we wanted that a world where they can thrive just as white men can thrive. So, but it also resulted in us over a period of the following 8 to 9 years to become a diverse group of with gender parity on the investment team, and that in itself has repercussions on what kind of investments we make, because we have a less of a monocultural view on what is important in the world, and that is, I think, is our role as investors is incredibly important to do.
But there's something that I immediately thought of, particularly with the example that you just made, PJ. We actually don't yet know exactly that the whole bunch of ESG factors that can range from thinking about what your supply chain looks like, to responsible design, unintended consequences of the product, to diversity and inclusion, to how the governance of the company is set up. So there's a whole bunch of flowers in here, right? We don't know for each and every one of them, and definitely not as a collective, that it does make financial sense, right? There's an intuition that this is going to be what we're seeing, but even for public equities, there's a fantastic group at MIT that shows it's all confusing. You can pick your ESG rating agency and you get what you want, but actually we don't have solid proof that this makes sense. While we do for diversity and inclusion, right?
Which is, Johannes, why I also think this sort of external pressure from LPs I think it's a bit irrelevant almost, right? Because at the end it comes down to, as you said, the questionnaire, maybe the governmental investors that are a little bit more diligent there. But I think if you don't want to invest in the topic intrinsically as a team, and you pick the topics that you are passionate about and you believe you want to focus on, then you're just going to be in a sort of greenwashing type scenario, right? And I think similarly to PJ, we thought very early about like what is the most diverse team we can put together, going to a 50% female investment team, to also different backgrounds. And we thought about like what can we do to reduce our environmental footprint as well as a firm. That's fairly easy with what you can do there in order to reduce that or offset that. But then I think the most work we spent on was actually how can we get this to portfolio, and how can we come up with a model that fits the reality of our startups, right? Startups that are under extreme time pressure, they have scarce resources, they are focused on growth, they have very undefined processes in terms of structures, they're young, they have, you know, hundreds of different priorities. And what then can our role be to steer that in a way that you know, we can actually see impact?
Great, yeah. That you both, PJ and Philip, just spoke to what I wanted to get into next anyway. So you said, PJ, diversity and inclusion is very close to your heart. Basically, Philip, you said a similar thing about building your team internally. That was one of the core considerations here. Perhaps, Richard, to you, and then Agate, is there a best practice or 2 or 3 that you want to share that you've already tested, put in practice, something that you're doing that you would say makes sense to roll out across the industry because you've already, or you are already seeing the value that drives?
Yeah, I agree too that I think we can do the biggest impact through, so to say, our work with the portfolio companies and through, I mean, capital allocation. We are a small organization, but we will of course take our own medicine and walk the talk. But again, coming back to sort of say our ESG strategy, there are so many different things. So we have also selected what we think is most important across our own operations, how we do investing, and how we work with the portfolio companies. And I don't know which area we should dig into first, but if we stay, at the area of how we work actually with our portfolio companies, I very much agree to, because we also invest, so to say, very early on. I mean, they are very resource constrained. They have a lot of priorities. So if they don't succeed with what they're doing, it doesn't matter if they have the best ESG strategy and policy in the world. So it's also finding the right balance, not just pushing tons of different requirements and standards, but also to facilitate the discussions in the portfolio companies to they come up with their own ESG policy and strategy. They take responsibility for it and embrace it in what they do. So it's like, I mean, if we talk with our portfolio companies, like we talk with metrics and how to they should track. It's not like that we're pushing, oh, you should track this and this, because that is what we will track to our LP. So I prefer to have the discussion with the company, what makes sense for you in this case to work with, and they take responsibility for it. But I also, actually, when we talk with very young companies, I mean, they have a hard time figuring out how to address this topic. It's new for them. It's difficult. I think a lot of them are doing a lot of good things, but they sometimes need the tools and how-tos for how to get started. And to be honest, a lot of digital companies very early on sitting in Denmark, they don't have, I mean, a lot of sort of say ESG red flag risks, but there are a lot of opportunities, and I think there are a lot of low-hanging fruits there. So it's also how to guide them to address some of those issues. And I think if they can fix them early on, it's much easier doing that and incorporate it in their culture than doing it later. So I think actually we can do a big impact early on, but it's also figuring out the right balance and how to do it. And that is what we are trying to sort of say experiment with right now, and to develop. And actually we are sort of in the process of developing a how-to guide for young startups, highlighting some of the areas, I mean, early stage tech digital companies can start working with to make a real difference out there. And we have another sort of say academy event where we'll present that sort of say model.
So there's an area here where the VCs can finally deliver on the stereotypical promise that they add value.
I think, to be honest, I think it's a good start to discuss. I think we're discussing a lot to set goals and push reporting requirements, but I'm looking very much forward to the next phase where we can actually start how to help them and how to do it, and what is the best way of doing it without killing them with a lot of too much stuff.
Yeah. Agate, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, probably I have no more to add in terms of how to support the portfolio companies, but one kind of very practical tip that I can share from a fund's perspective that we do and that works really well in practice is that we touched a little bit, again, we keep on going back to what is impact, what is an impact fund versus generalist fund, because of what we have heard today, from all of you, is that us as individuals, of course, we love to do impact, and a lot of generalist VCs are doing more and more of impact. And I think that's very much reflection of where the individual's passions lie, but still being a generalist VC or impact fund is two very different things. And it's not saying one is better than the other, it's just two very different thematic strategies. But if you go down the route of being a thematic impact investor, that's the pillar stone of your strategy, then you need to really take it all the way. And how we differentiate ourselves is by linking our financial incentives with the impact targets that we have achieved. And that works really well in practice, because it goes back to, we can argue a lot about the gray areas of how to define impact, but to me it's crystal clear that if you can't measure something, then by definition it probably doesn't exist. If you have means of measuring it or tracking it, then you're already at least in the right direction. And what we do is that for every company that we invest in, we set impact targets. So we start off by setting 5-year impact targets, what we think this company has to achieve. And ultimately, our goal is that on a portfolio blended basis, we will achieve 100% of our impact targets. And of course, that means some companies will succeed and over deliver the impact targets. Some will fail, but ultimately it will blend to us having achieved the impact targets that we set out to do. And if we don't achieve our impact targets, none of us on the partnership team will get access to our carried interest. Then our carried interest will simply be donated to a number of charities that we have already pre-selected. And I think that's a really, if you want to be an impact fund, that's a very crystal clear, practical way of really showing, okay, this is a difference between me as an impact fund and maybe a generalist. And again, I'm definitely making the point that I don't think that one is better than the other. It's just two different things, two different strategies, but there certainly can be a lot of overlap in the type of companies that we invest in and the type of things that we pursue.
Yeah, I think what you're describing sounds quite similar to Ronald Cohen's impact-weighted accounting, which would take this to another level on the company portfolio level directly, right? Basically, what we are completely lacking, even in terms of measuring impact, and Philip, I know you're part of the Leaders for Climate Action, where it's all about measuring the carbon footprint and reducing it ultimately, so that, and there are similar tools and ideas for diversity and inclusion and improving diversity and then helping people to be better included. But these are all, in a sense, patchwork solutions to begin with, and it's all not really tied to what you just described, right? Which is really blending what we said in the beginning and what this idea of expanding shareholder value to stakeholder value. But how do you do that, right? And the short answer so far, I think, is we don't really know.
We don't really know, but on the other hand, I think just because we don't have the full solution doesn't mean we shouldn't start small. I think that's also, to me, very important. The way we thought about it is like, what can we do actually, right? And there's easier things and there's more difficult things. So just going back in terms of how can we impact our portfolio? Whenever we do investment, whenever we sign a term sheet with a company, it is a commitment for us to invest on a certain valuation under certain terms. And we decided to implement a commitment to ESG in that term sheet explicitly to the company. So that is also then in the shareholder agreement once the legals are drafted. So that is, it's not more than a commitment, but it shows the attention we are giving to this topic. And we want to flag this very, very early. We basically want to flag this before the company decides to work with us. So that's sort of one small thing that we did. And then we partnered up with a group called from Start Global. They developed a framework called ROSE that it's a lightweight sort of system, I would say, that fits the reality of our portfolio companies. We pay for the service, right? It's a self-assessment that the company does. It's then resulting into improvement goals, and then at the end, evaluation of the impact that they then do. And for us, it's a good way of tracking this and showing that we care And of course, then you can, do individual initiatives for the firm, whether it's, carbon offsetting or like you fostering female entrepreneurship on the diversity side. So it is patchwork, but at the same time, I'd rather have like lots of activism on all of these different topics rather than waiting for the big golden bullet that probably doesn't exist.
Takes us to the last question I wanted to raise before we'll have some time to answer the questions. There's some question marks, right? And there are some solutions and some approaches to this, but what do you think, and perhaps Peter, we can start with you. What do you think is the biggest challenges ahead when it comes to pushing this further into the industry? And some of you said at the moment there's actually potential for this to be a differentiating factor. My gut feeling and intuition now, speaking to many people around the world about this is going to be normal business in 10 years. There's going to be a convergence that ESG, at least, not necessarily impact, but ESG is going to be the same as what your normal accounting is going to be today. But between that and where we are now, what do you think the biggest challenges is and are, and what we can do in that respect?
Yeah, I think that we now, a little bit more than a year into the pandemic, the digital transition has gone with breakneck speed, and we have really seen a phenomenal change of pace. And at the same time, I think the investment returns have never been better for the venture ecosystem. So I think there is also a little bit of a what can go wrong mentality right now, and you're probably also reading in a lot of false positives into this situation right now. So what I'm most worried about is that when the day comes when the tide turns and we get really tough headwinds, will we then sort of continue this thrust of, and will the differentiation be a part of the successful way to sort of back to prosperity, or will we converge back to the dirty, cheap, bad methods, because the returns, the law of returns basically dictate at the end of the day what we do. That's what I'm most concerned about, and I don't think we are really there. I experienced it myself firsthand back in 2007, 2008, when the financial crisis basically wiped out the entire European clean tech industry. That was at that time, that industry was there was one of our biggest investment themes, and about a third of our portfolio was invested into the clean tech sector. And what was different then is that pretty much everything at that time was built on the idea of subsidies in order to get it to sustainable, economic status before then it could live on its own. But what happened with the crisis was that all those subsidies went away and everyone died. And instead, China now basically holds all the cards in the sustainability phase that we actually led some 12 years ago. So I'm really concerned about that potential impact.
No, I completely agree. And one, I guess, different angle, and that's also kind of, if you think about what I'm most worried about this, around this positive trend, which is into the direction of ESG and impact, it links back to a little bit what Philip was saying. Like, I'm mostly scared. I think this trend is so positive, but what I'm scared about is that people expect too much perfectionism, that sometimes I even feel as an impact investor, I'm of course on panels all the time, and people of course turn to me as like, you're the impact investor, now give me the bulletproof definition of what is impact. And I'm fully aware of the fact that it's not bulletproof and it's not crystal clear that X, 1 + 1 = 2. Of course, there is still a lot of interpretation. There is a lot of qualitative assessment around it, and the same goes for ESG. And I'm just scared that the critics of this positive trend will kind of saying like, oh guys, in the end of the day, it's not a perfect science. We can't do this perfectly. So let's just scrap this whole trend as a whole. And that's the biggest fear for me, because I think we're all directionally right. And maybe it doesn't need to be perfect. And as long as we make small steps towards something better, when you aggregate all of it, it really has an impact. And back to also from portfolio companies, I see across our portfolio, some founders take ESG impact extremely seriously. They really want to max out. Some founders honestly just want to qualify, just to do the bare minimum. But even them doing the bare minimum is a step in the right direction, because if the choice is between doing bare minimum or at least actively be aware that someone is asking you to report on this yearly, you're already at least a little bit in the right direction. So I just hope we don't kill a very positive trend by being too critical and seeking too much perfectionism into it.
Richard, Philip, do you want to also take a second before we get into some of the questions?
Richard, after you.
Yeah, I agree very much to what you have said there. On a more practical level, we are sort of say all on a learning curve. I mean, we have worked with this, but we have just started to work on these issues. It's a complicated field. There's a lot of issues and how to do all these things. So I also hope that the sort of say startup ecosystem can work together on figuring out some standards for how to do it, so we are not all pushing in different directions. And I also hope that we will see, so to say, both classical tech VCs, they will probably, coexist with impact investors in the same cap table. How will that work out, and how can, so to say, everyone work together to move in the right direction and help the startups and make the difference, and not just be like some kind of, yet another reporting requirement we need to comply to. So, that's my hope, at least on a short term.
My hope is to what PJ said, and I share this concern, but my hope is that there's enough pull from people like us, but most importantly, from the consumers or the customers of the products of the companies that we're investing in, that will require companies to basically stick to these ESG values. And I think that is probably something that is new, because it is more top of mind that it has been in the media, whether it's climate crisis or the health crisis of the last year, or whether it's gender diversity. These are topics that are becoming much more top of mind than they were in the last financial crisis. So hopefully that then prevents this from happening.
Yeah. Great. Shall we get to some of these questions? So the first one here that some people liked is one that goes right in there, back to your consideration around science and making it as specific and measurable as possible. Do you have any, have you seen anything? Do you have any best practices that you use yourself when it comes to quantifying, i.e. is there metrics that you use, measurements that you use when it comes to ESG? I would bracket out the risk. I don't think we have to think about it in terms of risk at all, but in terms of, is there anything that you already do as a fund when it comes to that? Anyone?
I can start really. As I mentioned, so we use this framework to get a bit of objectivity into the assessment. We use sort of a self-commitment to ESG within our legal documentations, and we address this topic very early on, and then through this group that we then have worked with the portfolio companies to do the self-assessment and then derive concrete improvement goals, and then also us tracking on the progress. This is sort of a framework that we've chosen for us now to get started. Frankly, is it perfect? Definitely not. We wanted to have something which is, on the one hand, meaningful enough, at the same time also, it's possible to handle it as an early stage company, given that the companies, when we invest in them, they're typically only a few people, and everyone's juggling 10 balls at the same time.
Anyone else wants to jump in there with concrete?
We do have it's probably more of a risk measurement than a opportunity measurement. It's like a 1 to 3 level, like ESG risk, and basically with the 1 being a low risk, that means that you're at least handling the risks in a good way. And then we work together with a few external organizations to both for ourselves, but also for portfolio companies to build specific skills and also to measure what's important. And when it comes to diversity and inclusion, we are part of a group called where basically we are certified diversity VC, one of the few in Europe, and that means that we follow their guidelines on how to follow up this, not only sort of on the top layer, but how they do with their recruiting, what they do with everything from maternal, paternal leave policies and stuff like that, in order to sort of actually have policies that support the underlying reason why there is or there isn't diversity and inclusion happening. And on the sort of climate side, we're working with Leaders for Climate Change, and they have proposed basically a methodology for first to put it already at the term sheet stage, to make sure that it's a theme that actually lives past the investment, and then how to engage the company in positive ideas on how to reduce their climate their carbon footprint. And then we have that as a discussion theme, but it would be too hard to say that we're sort of that we're rating them on that. We think that if they are interested and pursue it, then we sort of like it. If they have other priorities, because there's so much to do, we can't be their judge in that regard, but we can only inspire them.
Agate, Richard, you want to add something here as well?
I would just add the perspective that yes, the easiest thing to measure very concretely and track is everything in the diversity and inclusion bucket. That of course we track also key KPIs on that front, and we track the improvement of those key KPIs over longer time. When it comes to an environment part, it's harder to track it with specific KPIs, and that usually ends up being more kind of commitments of what do we do to reduce our environmental footprint as a result of our business organization. So would definitely love to learn more about how to make that more concrete, more tangible, and kind of linked to numbers rather than commitments.
Yeah, we can also, being conscious of time, there's another question that just came in that I find very interesting from Julio here. So basically referring to this is going to be impact ESG is going to be common sense in 10 years. He says this would be great, but the current reality seems to show that many VCs are still funding solutions that actually create new problems, e.g. one-click buying being added to social media, or buy now, pay later models, or I would add Robinhood is only ever going to be lauded, but there's obvious problems with that we already have seen. Further advancing consumerism and or indebtedness, what do you think would take especially generalist VCs, and three of you are falling squarely into that bucket, to say no to clearly profitable solutions because of ESG considerations, right? So in other words, when is this going to be big enough of a consideration to say, I might be able to make money with this, but actually it's not worthwhile?
I think this is an excellent question. I think I think the honest answer is nobody has solved this. I think how can you approach it, or how can we think about it? Of course, then it goes back to how do you define sort of positive or negative impact, right? Do you say a Robinhood is bad because, you know, there people are losing money, or like they are jiking up stock values that are overvalued? Or do you say it's good because you're democratizing stock ownership, you're enabling people to generate wealth by giving them access to financial instruments that didn't have access before, right? So there you have it. This is sort of just at the end 2 viewpoints. So there's obvious cases, and there are the easiest, right? Because then you have to say no to them. And then there is the hard ones, which are the middle cases. I think the very positive ones are also clear, right? So in the juice is in the middle as usual. And then I think it comes down to how you define it and how you then, you know, assess the impact. And I think there, what can you do? I think what you can do is make sure you look at this in an honest and mostly and ideally completely unbiased way, and sort of look at really all the pros on the list, look at all the cons on the list, and then make a conscious and authentic decision.
And just to add to that, we have looked at a number of startups where there is some sort of addressing the existing car market, like car dealers and selling cars in a different way, and that it's clearly a disruption happening in the car sales industry, where the, you know, local dealerships are sort of being pushed out by direct-to-consumer models. We haven't really made any investments, although we have looked at many of them. I think at the end of the day, we have sort of looked at each other and said, should we be a part of this paradigm? And then we haven't really been excited enough, although they have shown extreme impressive growth. So perhaps we are not doing our job from a fund management perspective by declining such, but we sort of live with the idea that that's a dying paradigm anyway. So we think that in the long run we will be right, but maybe we're just, you know, fooling ourselves. I don't know.
And at the end of the day, PJ, I think you can always have different views on this, right? Yeah. Is it wrong to sell used cars if you then, you know, extending their lifetime and giving it to people that they can continue using? Or is it right to invest in scooters because you are making the city mobile and you're looking at electric powered transportation? Or is it wrong because people are throwing them in the river, right? So
But I think maybe also the change is here that, I mean, it's a good change that is being discussed as part of the investment process, and ESGs will be addressed there. So it will come up and discussed, and then it's more like, can you see yourself as part of this? Do we want to be part of creating that future? And also doing a sort of say ESG risk and opportunity assessments in the due diligence. I mean, issues like this will come up and it will initiate the discussions. It will probably not solve it, but I think it's good discussions, and there are a lot of gray areas. And yeah.
Yeah. And I don't think, again, like back to like, we'll never really get the 100% perfection, but you definitely hear more and more case studies. And I've heard of, not to name names, but, you know, let's say us as VCs, it's you follow into your winning winners in your portfolio. And I have heard, you know, big, let's say European household name funds saying no to performing follow-on investment because the company didn't meet their diversity KPIs or even regressed in those. And I think as long as we have a couple of those examples, it just pulls more and more people into that direction. You know, will 100% of the market act that way one day? I don't think so. But, you know, again, as long as more and more people get inspired by those bold acts, again, we're on the right trend.
Yeah, I think that would be my last words as well. I'm very happy that there's 4 leaders here in the room that can make these decisions, and in some ways are already bold enough to make these decisions, but I think that's what it takes, right? There's always going to be different viewpoints on whether it makes sense financially or not. It takes leadership, and I think that's definitely one of the things that I would like everyone to take away. This is a big development and trend. There's a lot of work to be done, and we've heard a lot of starting points today from all of you, and thank you very much for sharing that with us. And I think thanks to all of you for coming. And we've had at times up to 70 participants. Sorry, we didn't get to all the questions, but do feel free to reach out and enjoy the rest of your sunny or not so sunny Thursday. To be continued.